This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson.
Yes, this is your host, Harry Wilkinson, and welcome to the Spirit and Wellness Show. This is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks, events, happenings in the world, happenings in politics, science, technology, the media, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective, from a perspective of unity and oneness, from a point of view of the stories we are telling about ourselves, how we're creating them, how we can take our energy from them, and how we can create new stories. And it's always very difficult when you have a news week like this one to take that approach. And as I've said many times when I've had to do this show after a tragedy has occurred, whether it is a terrorist attack as we have just witnessed, or in many cases the death of a beloved public figure, a school shooting, I always end up saying the same thing. But it always takes me a moment, at least. And this one has been taking me more than a moment to work through. What I say is that we create these incidents. These incidents happen as ways to bring us together, as ways to reconnect with the truth of who and what we really are, as ways to understand our transcendence beyond these situations, the physical realm. And it's hard to get to that state, and this particular incident has been a little bit harder for me than others have been. But I return, I go back to that, and I reinforce that, and I begin to see it that way once again. But for a moment, you're taken out of it. As well you should be. Because part of you should be in the so-called, if you want to put it this way, the game or the hologram, as I put it, the creation we've made, the experience of the horror, the terror, the anger, the frustration, all of those things. I mean, we create these situations so that we can experience those, but also so that we can move through them, take our energy from that, and realize what we've done, which is once again to create another story that we can triumph again, over by realizing our true nature. And it's hard to get there when you see the death of people. And if you are a spiritual person, and if you believe that we are not our bodies, but we are much more than that, then you know that, or you understand that there is much more going on here than meets the eye. That the people who lost their physical bodies are not gone. But as I say, It's hard to get to that in the midst of all of this. And because of where we are, because we're in the human game, our first impulse is, shock, horror, grief, as well it should be. It's part of the game. But also, behind it all, if you could have a dawning awareness, or at least I picture it as a light, or a light in the back of your mind that keeps you understanding, keeps you at a level of awareness that while you're participating in this and while you're feeling all of this, you also know that it is part of the game, that this is illusory, that the truth goes beyond the admittedly unimaginable and unignorable situation. As I say, it's part of the game. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to be there. We're supposed to play that. And then when we understand that there's more going on, that beyond this is something that is, as I guess this is a Bible quote, I'm not sure, but it certainly rings for me, a peace that surpasseth. I'll try that again, I'm sorry. A peace that surpasses all understanding. That's where we get to. That's the higher perspective. Knowing that around all of this, above all of this, underneath all of this, it's all peace. And we create these situations, these wars, these attacks, to give us this experience of what we really are not, to give us this illusory experience of war and of destruction and of death, which in a way is the ultimate illusory experience. At least if you look at death as an ending of something. So, as I say, this one's been a little harder than most. And I'm assuming that everybody knows what I'm talking about. And I assume it because it's just been the biggest news story around. But in case you're not sure what I'm talking about the attacks that happened Friday night in Paris. If you don't know, there were several attacks that happened that night throughout the city. That resulted in, I think the latest count is 150 people who lost their lives. I'm sorry, latest is 129 dead and 352 injured. This includes an attack on a theater called the Bataclan Theater in Paris. It's a music hall. People were inside to see a concert and ended up getting held hostage and being killed. Apparently, last count was about 129 people, 89 of which were in this music hall. Others died in attacks in restaurants. An American college student was killed that way. And what they're saying now, although they're still investigating, so we aren't entirely sure, but most people are already gone to the assumption that it is a terrorist attack, and a very well coordinated one that was so well coordinated that our regular methods of anti-terrorism techniques from Homeland Security and so forth didn't detect anything. Wasn't on anybody's radar, apparently. But one of the interesting things that has come to light here, and that's why I, referring to this as War and Peace in the Age of Transition, is something that came to mind, or that has come about mainly through internet and Twitter. And that's the fact that while the mainstream news media had and continues, I think right now, they're still having continuing coverage of the effects of this Paris attack. The fact that the day before, there was another huge terrorist attack. But you and I probably, I'm assuming you probably didn't hear about it either. I know I didn't. We didn't know that. It's interesting that a choice was made, and that this is thought to be possibly a clever move on the part of the ISIS group, which many people have already said is to blame for this. But the fact is that when the bombs go off in Paris, in a Western country that's filled with a lot of Westerners, a lot of white Westerners, it's all over the news. However, the attack, which happened in Lebanon, got little or no coverage at all. Here's what happened in Beirut. On Thursday, the day before the Paris attacks, there were suicide bombings in Beirut that left 43 people dead and 239 wounded. This is being attributed to an ISIS cell sent to Lebanon from their Syrian stronghold. However, news media did not pick this up and cover it. The way that it got covered, the way people found out about it, was through Google Trends. Google Trends shows who's searching for things, trends on who's searching the internet. Twitter as well. And this is showing the change, and this is part of our transition era, the disparity in news headlines and what people really want to know about. You see, the news headlines, the choices of what gets covered, in the mainstream media, in your 24-hour news coverage, in your newspapers. Those decisions are made by what we call gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are news editors, producers, cable television stations who make the choices of what news stories they want to present to us and what news stories aren't that important to present to us. And while gatekeeper media, worked for years, when we had no other way of knowing how to get information, and in those years, we relied on these gatekeepers, and we trusted them. We trusted them as sources because they acted as such. They acted as journalists and reporters that sought through information and presented it to us. There wasn't a real push or need to fight for ratings because news was news, and news wasn't supposed to be judged by ratings. And that was the way it was for a long time. Until relatively recently. And when I say relatively recently, I'll say, the 24-hour news cable channels came in the early 90s. So I would say somewhere around the mid-90s, especially when I think probably the main event was when President Clinton sort of defanged the FCC. Because up until that time, the FCC regulations for any company that owned a station and used public airways, which is what the airwaves are, by the way. They are public airwaves. So anything that's being broadcast is being broadcast over airwaves that we own. They belong to us. We lease them to CBS, ABC, NBC, and so forth to use to entertain us and inform us. And what the FCC was supposed to do was to be a watchdog to make sure that those that were using our public airwaves were telling us the truth, giving us all the information, or as much information as possibly could be given, giving us different sides of the information, if there was a bias or perspective, and presenting things that were in the public interest locally in your town. So if you had a Channel 7 in your town that was connected to the ABC network, they also were supposed to not only just show ABC network programs, but present programming that was informative and helpful for local people in that town. That situation began to change, and it's evolved ever since. So what you've seen is among the traditional gatekeepers, the traditional news outlets, and even your local TV stations, you're not getting all the news. You're getting either chopped up versions. You might get headlines but not get deeper information. Or you may not hear about it at all, as in the case of this attack in Beirut. And there's been, quite a bit of discontent around this. There was one Twitter post that said, "Dear Facebook, nice French flag overlay, but how do I change my profile picture to show solidarity with the people of Beirut?" Because Facebook has this French flag overlay that a lot of people, certainly among my Facebook friends, have used, to show their solidarity. But this person is quite right. There's nothing about Beirut. And I'm not sure how many people even know that anything happened. And it's a bias. and you might call it a racial bias, and it's something that is pretty stark. Paris gets bombed in this way. Now, the Paris bombings were probably more devastating. Certainly more people died, but that shouldn't make that much of a difference. And there was also a heroic story in this Beirut, which is something that, the news media would and should have glommed onto. A gentleman by the name of Adel Termos, in a marketplace with his daughter, saw the first explosion, saw another bomber preparing to detonate, and tackled him to the ground. He caused the second suicide bomber to detonate. And according to a physician there in Beirut who was involved in this, he says there are many, many families, hundreds of families probably, who owe their completeness to his sacrifice. Unfortunately, Termos and his daughter were killed in the explosion. And there were many tributes to him on Twitter. One says, rest in peace, Adel Termos, who sacrificed himself by tackling a suicide bomber preparing to kill hundreds in Lebanon. Another said, today I stand with Paris. 2 days ago I stood with Beirut. Rest in peace, Adel Termos, you saved so many. Hashtags, together we stand, divided we fall, be safe. So it seems like if ISIS is behind this might be part of a global wave of terrorism. But the interesting thing to note here is how different the coverage was. And part of it is a Western, bias. And if you'll forgive me, a white Western bias. Part of it is sort of the idea that, Beirut, something's always blowing up in Beirut. That's the kind of image that has been given to us from the news media. But this man's story is remarkable, and the fact that nothing about him was mentioned in the news media, in the traditional news media, but that he is a hero in the new media, really is saying something about how we deal with these sorts of things. Another thing to bring up is Al-Shabaab. A lot of people don't even know what Al-Shabaab is, but Al-Shabaab is another terrorist organization, quite similar to ISIS. And in April of this year, they had an attack on Kenya, 147 dead in a Kenyan university. But we didn't hear about that very much. So it's understandable that people are feeling scared. They should, as I said. It's part of the game. You should be. On the other hand, you should also hold on to your awareness that this is not all there is, that there is peace behind all of this. And that part of this is our remembering that, reconnecting with that. And another part of it is, understanding the nature of attacks. Attack is the result of a feeling of separation. That we are separate. We are not one. We are not one with divine mind. And that some are better than others. That you are different from me, therefore you are hurting me. These attacks are really attacks upon ourselves. So when a terrorist attacks, blows up a lot of people, and then blows up himself, that's really what he's doing. He's attacking himself. And when we attack, whether it's a warlike attack, or if it's just an attack verbally, or just in thought, when we send negative thoughts about anyone, it's an attack, and any attack is an attack upon yourself. Because as much as you think you're hurting someone else for reasons that you feel justified in hurting people, the effect on yourself is just as devastating, if not more, because we are one, and when we attack someone else, we are attacking an illusion, and the reality of it is an attempt to attack ourselves. But it's hard to do that when the fires of hatred are stoked, when a belief system is in place that continues to move forward and does not understand and is not understood by others. And so that's why these attacks occur. That's why we continue to use them to remind us, to bring us to the peace that surpasses all understanding. Now, this is a post that's been going around on Facebook. It's very moving. I don't agree with all of it, but it brings up some very important points, so that's why I'm going to share it. It is not Paris we should pray for, it is the world. It is a world in which Beirut, reeling from bombings 2 days before Paris, isn't covered in the press. A world in which a bomb goes off at a funeral in Baghdad, and not one person's status update says Baghdad, because not one white person died in that fire. Pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for a terrorist attack. Yes, because there's much in the news about, the refugees are the ones that have caused this problem. And if there weren't those refugees coming over the border into Paris, trying to save themselves and their family from a devastating war in Syria, then there wouldn't have been the terrorist attack. So pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for a terrorist attack, that does not pause to differentiate between the attacker and the person running from the very same thing you are. Pray for a world where people walking across countries for months, their only belongings upon their backs, are told they have no place to go. Say a prayer for Paris, by all means, but pray more for the world that does not have a prayer for those who no longer have a home to defend. For a world that is falling apart in all corners and not simply in the towers and cafes we find so familiar. It's powerful and it gets its point across. I don't want to leave with the sentiment that the world is falling apart. It isn't. In fact, the world is a much more peaceful place than it's ever been. And it's helpful to remember that. To remember that beyond all of this truly is peace. And that while these incidents galvanize our attention, when we go in and go beyond them, we discover much more than any news report, any body count, or any other kind of judgment